strong differences in the impacts it's having.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ruby. That's the end of your 15-minute session now. Can you please turn off your microphone, stop your video? And our next talk is by Kynan Hartog-Burnett. Kynan, can you please share your screen and turn on your microphone and your camera? Kynan is from James Cook University, and his talk is titled Sprats, a reef fish, not vagrant pelagic fish. Thank you very much, Kynan. Could you please share your screen? Thank you.
Is that working?
That is working, Kynan.
Cool.
The only thing is we can see your note slides rather than your presentation slides at the moment.
Excellent. I'll just swap that over.
Yes, please. Looks good now. Off you go.
Cool. Hi guys, I'm Kynan, as you guys know. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about Spratelloides on the reef. They're a group of clupeiform fishes, and I'm kind of playing around a little bit with what the idea of an actual reef fish is. I've been having some trouble finding a definition, so what I'm going to be using today for my talk is the following definition: that reef fishes are fish that are strongly associated in an obligatory way with reefs. So when we're talking about these fish, we're finding fish that typically we think of really colourful ones, and we think of things that are spending the majority of their life history on a reef, and either being their way of living is driven by what is present on the reef, or they are actually forming the reefs themselves. So where I'm kind of coming from is asking whether we could think of a fish like this, that we would typically think of as a very pelagic fish, as a reef fish as well. So to begin with, I thought I'd give you guys some background about this group of fishes. Clupeiformes are an abundant metropolitan group of very small forage fishes. They typically don't live for very long, and we think of them mainly as a very basal group in terms of food chains, typically being involved in energy movement between lower groups such as phytoplankton, and moving them up into higher consumers like those that we like to eat. They're also really important for world fisheries. In the last FAO report, they made up the majority of the gross tonnage that we caught, and at quite some value worldwide. We also need to define some units such as stocks. When we're talking about a stock, we're talking about mesopopulations within a wider metapopulation. The metapopulation might be the entire distribution of a species. These stocks within them typically have low levels of connectivity between them, and then you have local populations contained within those that typically might have higher levels of connectivity. When we're talking about a reef fish, we normally expect the level of different reefs might be the level that we might find variation. And we've seen that before with fishes such as Acanthochromous polyacanthus. And it can be quite varied between different groups of what we think of as reef fishes. So my interest was to come in using this kind of framework and go, what's happening with clupeiforms on reefs? These kind of connectivity measures are quite defined by different population dynamics, such as immigration and emigration, recruitment, growth, mortality, and spawning. And I think all of these factors can drive what we think of as a reef fish, and we may have some preconceptions based on these kind of values that might be driving it a bit more than we thought. In terms of the spatial scales that a lot of these things can be operating over, what I was looking at mainly for my research was looking at differences between regions within the Great Barrier Reef, and then specific reefs within those regions. So here at the top, we've got the Capricorn Bunker, and then One Tree Island, where I did a lot of my work. And then there's different zones within those reefs that we might find variation as well. And keeping in mind that as that spatial scale increases, in general, we'd expecting the time for connectivity to increase as well. So in temperate areas for this group of fishes, which is where a lot of our knowledge for Clupeiformes comes from, we'd be expecting very large stock sizes in terms of spatial area and in terms of numbers. And that often these stocks are defined more on where the fish is at a certain point in time rather than a genetic basis to it or where the fish is year round. So when we're thinking about them on a reef, this is what I think of when I think of Clupeiformes on a reef. They're fairly closely associated with the reef, but they're not that typical demersal fish or that epibenthic fish that's living right on the bottom. That said, I've failed to find them massive distances off the reef. So here you've got a bunch of predators that are sitting just below a massive school of Spratelloides gracilis. In the tropics, we find that they've been exploited in the Pacific Islands and Japan. And despite abundance and dietary importance to other species, they've received very little attention in terms of research, especially in the last 30 years. The group that I've been working on really specifically is the Spratelloidini. Taxonomically, it's in a little bit of a grey zone at the moment where they're not sure where it fits within the Clupeiformes group. And that was part of the reason why we were interested in having a look at them. There's 2 genus and 8 species, but only 2 of them are really common in the Indo-Pacific, and they're the ones that I've based my research on, which is Spratelloides delicatulus, this top fish here with the blue back, and then Spratelloides gracilis here with the silver stripe on its side. We know that in terms of their variation in abundance, that they show patterns both cross-shelf and latitudinally, and that we've also found patterns in terms of their demography over the same scales. So up in Lizard Island, which is very much in the north of the Great Barrier Reef, and then Wanchar Island, which is very much in the south of the Great Barrier Reef, we found that the maximum size that these fish grow to is considerably different. And then the maximum age they reach also varies. So in the south, they get a lot older and they tend to get a bit bigger, whereas in the north, they tend to stay smaller and not live for as long. Then we went and had a look at some of the reproductive development and how these fish went to maturity in terms of reproduction, and found that it was much more of a size mediated process than it was an age one. So these fish get to around the 40 millimeter size. Sometimes it's a bit smaller, sometimes it's a little bit bigger. And this is supported by wider research that basically that's about the time when they start to mature. And the last point where we observe mature individuals is usually around that 45 millimeter length. So all of this, when we go back to this sort of age thing, is suggesting that these fish are getting to reproductive at about the 50 to 60 day mark. And then basically they've got a very short window in which to reproduce, get their offspring, and then turn over to the next stage. And my suggestion would be that that is much more similar to a reef fish such as our small gobies and blennies than it would be to something that we think of more as a pelagic with a lot of our larger, trevally and such like that. There's a few other observations that I think are really important for thinking about these guys as reef fish. All of the literature suggests that they're an entirely reef-based group of fish. They present demersal spawning, where they lay their eggs in shallow, sandy areas around the reef, typically less than 5 meters. The larvae appear to be retained within the lagoons of reefs. And from my surveys that I've done, I've only observed the larvae within the lagoons of reefs. I haven't managed to catch any or observe any away from the reef. And some taxa are rarely observed even on the outside of reefs. They're only really found on the inside. So to have a look at this, we went down to the Capricorn Bunker and we went to a bunch of different reefs. We did visual counts on the inside and outside of these lagoons. And what we found was that between the 2 species that we looked at, one species was found far more on the outside of the lagoon, whereas the other species was found far more on the inside of the lagoon. When we went and light trapped in the same sort of way to check that we were right, we found that the same pattern was holding across all of the reefs that we looked at, where Spratelloides gracilis, which gets a little bit bigger, lives a little bit longer, tends to be found more outside on the slope. and Spratelloidis delicatrulus, which is this slightly smaller species that I've focused most of my research on, was basically only found within the lagoons. When we looked at this at a size class where we defined them as larvae, juveniles, and adults, the larvae were only observed within the lagoons for both species, and the juveniles were again predominantly found for both species only within the lagoons. It was only really at the adult stage that we saw schools that appeared on the outside of these reefs. Now, just to make sure, we wanted to make sure that we weren't being biased by only looking at the reef. So we went and sampled a bunch of interreefal waters with distance from shore off One Tree Island. And when we placed light traps out, you've got a scatter plot here which shows the distance from the crest compared to the number of fish caught. And what we found was that when you got to the edge of the plume, you basically didn't catch any more fish. So all of that suggested to us that the lagoons and the slopes were much more important for these fish than interreefal waters were. And that suggested to me that these guys are living far more on the reef. Now, to provide some extra evidence, what we thought we would do is go and have a look at the stock structure in terms of the genetics to see if that would show patterns that either highlighted a pelagic sort of life history or a reef-based one. So if it was a pelagic fish, we kind of expect there'd be high levels of connectivity and the stock would be pretty homogeneous given what occurs in the temperate species for this group would look something like this. Whereas if it was a reef fish, we'd expect to see some level of stock structure within it that might appear like this. So when we mapped out the haplotypes that occurred for all these fish, we looked at roughly 30 fish per reef across 12 different reefs. And we found that the north and south were very strongly differentiated, and the central reefs that we sampled were less so. So if we plot that out onto a map, we can see here that the northern group doesn't share many haplotypes with the southern group whatsoever. And interestingly, we had a reef that was found in the central GBR at Orpheus Island that shared haplotypes with no other reef on the Great Barrier Reef. When we then went and tried to look at what might be driving this, we suggested that it might be an oceanography or an isolation by distance kind of model. The isolation by distance model kind of falls apart given that you have this staggered fragmentation of these different stocks, and oceanography appeared to be a much better explanation of it, but there's still more research for us to do there. And when we look at more specific between reef sort of values, we can see that even at the scale of 48 kilometers, you can have entirely different compositions of haplotypes of these reefs. So the colored haplotypes are the primary haplotypes that were found in the north, and then the blue in the south. And then this gray one is shared haplotypes with other reefs within a similar region, so in this case, the north. And then these black private haplotypes were only found at that reef. So interestingly, over the scale of only 48 kilometers there, we had massive variation. Whereas when we looked even at the scale of 7 kilometers between Heron Island and One Tree Island, we found that even at that distance, you could have significant variation. So if we bring it back to that question of, you know, what is a reef fish and do these fish deserve to be reef fish? My suggestion is that we say yes, because of a few of these different factors, namely that the early life and reproduction is reef-based. The dietary importance is very high for both obligate and facultative reef predators. They're rarely found off the reef. The genetic patterns that we observed were more akin to a demersal spawning reef fish than any of the pelagic fishes that I could find this kind of data for. And there's strong evidence that geomorphology may be playing a role in the maintenance of this genetic diversity. That being that the reefs themselves are actually helping to define the genetics that we observe in these fish, rather than broader ocean currents and things that might be driving them if they were a pelagic group of fish. So to finish up, I'd like to say thank you to a whole lot of collaborators and the research stations that I've done some work at, and I'll leave you with these.